Talking about any board game runs into a pretty common problem for my form of critical analysis. What I do is typically a form of autoethnography. I have an experience, I document the experience, and then I engage critically with what I document and see if I can find any interesting ideas. We call them epiphanies in that documented information. When I'm talking about board games, I'm necessarily talking about an experience I get to share as a treat with some of my favorite people in the world. What I mean is anytime I play a board game, I'm probably going to have a good time with it unless the game is itself pretty egregious. It colors all experiences. What's more, there's an extra complication here because today's game is a legacy cryptography game, which means that there's a full spoiler warning risk here. I don't intend to discuss specific plot points later in the story, but I am going to mention the kinds of things that can happen in this game, and there's a risk that just knowing about that constitutes a spoiler depending on your position on these things. It's a game about secrets and lies, and part of how the game unfolds is hiding things from the players, and that means necessarily, to talk about it, some of those facts are going to be mentioned. You good? All ashore who are going ashore? Alright. The Initiative is a puzzle box and legacy game and a kid's storybook and a toy box of indulgent pieces and a sleek puzzle, all pulled into a cooperative game in a lovely snug box by, and I apologize for this Polish name, Noah's, Cory Kandzieka. I've played the entire campaign with 3 of my favorite people in the world. What's particularly noteworthy is that when I started this game, the youngest player was 12, putting them squarely in the target for this game's story. Yes, story. The Initiative has a comic book that tells the story of a group of 4 kids on bikes who put themselves in the path of a complicated conspiracy of shifty individuals thanks to buying a second-hand board game from a garage sale. This is extremely cool and should be normalized as a behavior. The story feels well pitched to youths, at least, based on my middling experience of them. Nobody's getting cyberbullied or using their phone to write essays, but largely it feels relatable as someone who lived in a place where I could walk around outside after school. This story is told in 2 parts. 1, as a comic book, which provides the basic framing device and shows the setting, and 2, as a deck of numbered cards the players reveal throughout the course of the story based on successes and failures in the missions. Missions refers to a single play session of the game, setting up the pieces and the board and dealing with the mystery. The Initiative is fundamentally a cooperative action selection card-driven board game. The players are playing the kids who are themselves playing the board game, and in the board game the player characters are cool spies with special abilities. Each mission is defined by a predetermined puzzle card, which is set up by sliding it into a little stand with a flip-down cell set on it. Flipping down each cell reveals the puzzle answer, or whatever it's hiding, and then the game corresponds those cells to symbols on tiny little cardboard files. These files are stacked up in randomized heaps around a building space, and the players move through the space from spot to spot and rifle through the files with a variety of different actions. The board changes over the course of the game. The same board can be repurposed a few ways, with tiles that add walls and doors, and locked doors, and generally increases the challenge presented by the game's baseline material. Making these actions complicated, though, and where the cooperative part of the game gets all wrinkle-brained, is that the players can't just do the things they want to do. Instead, the 4 main action options are hungry beasts that require a card. To take an action, a player puts a card from their hand on that action option, but the card they put down has to be of a higher value than the top card on that stack, which means over the course of the game, fewer and fewer cards can be put on that stack, limiting how many times that action can happen at all. Complicating this further is that players don't know what cards are in any other player's hands. Players aren't supposed to communicate what cards they have, and so a player may think they have a really low card to put on an action, which won't interfere with anyone else, but they have no way to explicate that. Do I mean a 3 when I say pretty low? Or would I reserve that title for only a 1? What about a 2? Cards can be used to power special abilities as well, chucking them into a discard pile directly without putting them into the stacks. Players can clear the stacks with the refresh action, but that's an action just like the others, and there's a limit on how many refresh actions the players can take, for the same reasons there are limits on other actions. There's a limit on how many actions players can take at all, because the deck of cards players are drawing from is itself limited, and when it runs out, players have to shuffle in these watch cards that indicate their time is running out. When drawing cards later on, if a player draws watch cards, they have to reveal them, and when 3 of the watch symbols get revealed, then it's game over. It's not quite game over though, because at any time the players can attempt to solve the puzzle presented on the card with as much or as little information as is available, and if they work it out, it counts as a win. In my experience, this does come up. I had a game where we busted out remarkably fast and wound up solving the puzzle through sheer cryptographic homework energy. Now, I'm not going to say the initiative is perfect at all as a board game. Particularly, the basic storage solution sucks. It's just too easy to put the pieces back in the box in a way that won't allow for a smooth box closure, which doesn't feel ideal. This is especially important when considering the box and pieces are meant to hide a lot of information from players, where small boxes or subdividers could be useful for keeping information properly hidden. This is not nothing. A game with as much clever engagement with the box that makes it up, a game using all of its surfaces to hide things under, that is important. And if the box is inconvenient, it's going to lead to scrutiny, and that runs the risk of making something fall out of its carefully controlled sequence of reveals. This is at this point just a list of the pieces and a sort of overview of the experience of playing the initiative in an abstract way. This is about what it's like to have played a game of the initiative, which does not count really as the same thing as talking about the game as a game. The initiative is a game with some elements in tension, and one of the points of tension is the target audience seems to be children, but there are actions the game requires that present problems that, in my experience, children can just have a hard time. Hell, adults have a hard time with them too, but when adults have a hard time with rules and make mistakes that damage the integrity of the game, they tend to be a bit more able to handle it and don't feel like they've ruined a game experience for everyone. In this case, it's entirely possible a kid can pull one of the watch cards off the deck in the second half of the game and not notice that they should have revealed it, and then they hang on to it because they don't want to interrupt the game and admit to having done something wrong. What's more, in the initiative, one of the main mechanics is keeping honest and quiet about cards in hand. Players can hint and be vague about it, but there's a sense of fair play and reasonable pressure on these things that's hard to dial into. And this is a place where I feel that the game becomes what I'm stuck thinking of as holistic design. There is a socially agreed upon boundary about what is the right amount of information that players can give up without it being wrong, but the rules in the book are not specific about that communication. The only way you'll learn you messed up is when someone else at the table becomes disappointed. Consider this extremely normal example. It is entirely possible for me to set up a set of keywords for each number. If I say picnic and that's on a chart indicating that I have a 1 in my hand, then that's true. That's not saying I have a 1. If that chart is public, then I'm obviously just conveying true information about my hand. On the other hand, what if nobody does know about that chart, but can later on deduce the table from playing with me over the course of games? Is that still obviously true information being conveyed? Am I giving up more information than I should when I say the word picnic? These are zones of meaning, and they are ambiguous ones. When dealing with children who are learning how to play games, the fact that the rules are so ambiguous becomes obvious. Now, the irony here is that I am saying that children and autistic people are alike in this difficulty, but I prefer to think of it as more, there is a problem here for autistic design that even thinking about holistic children will make obvious. Speaking of autism, though, some of the actual puzzles represent different ability levels and different relationships to information. One of them is remembering just a historical fact. A fact that's regional. Americans are going to be more likely to just know it, but to an Australian, it's vague as hell. In our case, one of our players had just done a test on the subject because the player is an actual kid in school, which bailed us out. There was another puzzle where I looked at the text of the puzzle, stared at it for a few minutes, went, hang on, that pattern only works with these letters, and then solved the whole thing off no information, which is on the one hand a real Billy Big Brain moment for me, but a complete anticlimax for the other players in the setup. While on the one hand, I would like to have just gone with my answer, shown how brilliant I am, and then moved on to the next mission, doing 2 back-to-back, other players didn't. But that's because I felt clever. That's why I thought that was cool. That bit of cryptographic solving happened in my head because I'm a dork who really likes exactly this kiddie level of cipher solving. It's not like it's a reasonable standard to expect of people, because if it was, this wouldn't be a board game called The Initiative. It'd be a kid's cipher solving book, like the one I remember from my childhood called On the Trail of Crypto, which I remembered as being really good and would have presented images of, but it is now deeply unfindable thanks to the plague of people using generative text machines to make children-targeted books about cryptocurrency. That book was just a short story with a cryptography puzzle in it, and solving the puzzle was like doing a little murder mystery, a wholly contained experience. The Initiative is a game that wants everybody to be there, and it makes its cryptography about everyone there. Hell, this is in my head a lot. There's a reason I've been calling all the puzzles in this game cryptography and ciphers, rather than code breaking, because they're not codes. There's a difference. This is a problem that can only exist because in this game, the puzzles are reasonably solvable without the game's materials. There are ways around this. One of the puzzles in the game is about deciphering a name rather than a commonly recognizable word, and that's a great example of a technique for obscuring cipher outputs. There's only so many English words, and with this example here, with these symbols arranged like that, there aren't many ways that this doesn't wind up being the word ending gging. On the other hand, what if it's a surname that ends eelne? There's no way my Wordle and Scrabble and Squares brain is going to find that, and in fact, the fact that it resembles other non-name words will throw me off. I think, as a designer, the Initiative does a sensible escalation. The game introduces new material, and you may wonder, how? Why? Trust me, the game has tricks hiding in the wings, and I like how it deploys them. But it doesn't drown the player experience in them. The game has about 3 or 4 major ways of changing the game from base assumptions, but they serve as more like exciting boundaries than they are about increasing complexity. By the end of the game, the early missions look quaint. They're simpler, and that's fine, but it means that players can focus on the weird puzzles of how to play out cards in the best or most appropriate order, rather than trying to crack the puzzle of what's going on in the game box itself. There's a problem that can come up with games, though it's as much a choice from the designer's position as anything, where new elements, once introduced, become the new normal, and they lose all their specialness. The Initiative does this with basically 2 elements, and it's pretty reasonable how they become normal, especially since they only have to last about 4 sessions as the main thing before they are now typical. But as a designer, I appreciate the way in that some cases they just stop being used when they're not creating novelty in the scenario. It's a good example of Matt in a hat, Matt with a cat with a hat, finally just Matt's cat, design. That's just one for the Auntie Donna fans out there. I think of this as solid advice on how to do permutations. When I run Dungeons & Dragons games, and why yes, I am fun at the parties I don't go to, I like to reuse all the components of an encounter, just rearranged differently. Being able to ambush enemies in one form, being put in a kill box in another, these are ways to use the game pieces in a novel form without necessarily needing novel pieces. Without disclosing what specifically I mean, this is a game about infiltrating a space, right? There's going to be things like laser grids or safe doors or computer security. The game doesn't, when those things first show up, go with laser grids and safe doors and computer security and also a robot. It introduces them and it lets players learn about how to deal with or avoid those things one at a time. It's very carefully paced. There's more, mind you. When we finished the game, there were a few hints and suspicious things that we thought might mean something and didn't wind up meaning anything to the plot. This is because there's a whole extra meta puzzle across the whole game at all its pieces that we have not yet solved. There is a huge commitment of time in this box, and that commitment is an expression of the things the designers had to do. This isn't procedural creation, and as much of the game systems that happen because a player can randomize a fistful of garbage, as much as the game can be extended by all the ways a deck can be shuffled, there is nonetheless an enormous amount of sheer bespoke work that goes into the game, and that work is all in aid of enabling players who can play the game enough times to finish the plot, then at the end of that find enough of a need to want to continue to do it all again and do it more. Now, part of this is that the designers have to have a brainworm to want to make this kind of game. People don't make elaborate ciphers then hand them out to people for money saying, bet you can solve this, unless they're looking for people who enjoy doing that. Their own particular sickos.pngs. And this is because they're having a form of fun as well. I have to imagine the designers sitting there trying to make the game fun to play because they find it fun to encode. They find puzzles a satisfying way of using their mind. It is playful, and it is that playfulness that takes me back to the original problem, the original contention with the game. How do I get to talk to you about this game, about how I played this thing, when a part of how much I love this game, which absolutely relies on cipher puzzles solvable by children, is the fact that I loved the moment when my sister's children, who are at this point their own damn people, looked at me and went in unison, "Whoa," as I worked out a puzzle and showed them my proof of concept. That's the problem with games, period, in that good games it's possible to play with forever, all the way through, those are games in which the player is able to fully cement themselves in what Bernard Suits calls a illusory attitude. To play the game entirely requires sinking into this space where I'm going to be playing a game. And that, it turns out, is fun. Bad games, as much as that means anything, are really evident because they jerk the player out of that illusory attitude. They stop being a thing to sink into. They resist the urge to have fun with them. The player gets thrown out of the experience like a car wreck, and then there's a point that any analyst can pick through and engage with and trace back through all the problems like wreckage. When a game is good enough, though, criticism can feel like it's just time to give up. The critic throws their hands in the air and says, "Who am I to point to it?" Or they just try to frothingly impress their opinions on people through sheer emotional extrusion. To be able to tell you about this game that I did play and didn't stop playing until it ran out, I have to be able to tell you about how I played and who I played it with. And that means that I'm always going to be trying to impart a little bit of a good time I had, knowing you don't have access to my extremely cool friends. That sucks for you. But you know who other players do have access to? The designer. The same amount I did. These puzzles were made by a person, by a puzzle pervert who wanted someone else to come along and solve them. A version of the piss wizard that isn't trying to coerce people into their magical realm. The rules and the pieces and the text all get scrawled onto stuff and put in my home, and that surface of the game has me on one side, but on the other side, like Alice through the looking glass, there's the designer, a Jabberwock just for me, putting the stuff there and hoping that I can work it all out. What the initiative offers is, most of all to me, an example of how much stuff, just stuff, is necessary for a game of its type. It's not enough to have a robust core engine that expands in complexity over playtime. It also needs interesting ciphers where they're ambiguous enough to make solving them rewarding and not obvious. It needs to be engaging as a story, and it needs to have characters that players care about helping to grow, and it needs to do all of this in a way that's affordable to produce, but also that affordability is directly tied into making sure no part of this game looks wildly out of place, because normal pieces need to look normal in order to hide their later surprises. I am a little bit sad about this game because I don't think I can reset it. I don't think I can expertly make this game a thing I can hand on to a new player so they can experience it the same way. It's worth trying to find a way to do it though, because this game is a wonderful, fun experience I want other people to get to enjoy. And being a physical board game, I can hand it on. This video was made in part thanks to the support of my patrons over on Patreon, and also with the collaboration of my partner and two of my relatives, whose specific titles I'm not comfortable sharing. Thank you so much for playing this game with me, and I guess, hi, why are you at this part of the video? You shouldn't be hanging around for any kind of Patreon plugs.